closed captions, add subtitles. Tonight, we'll be discussing Interior Chinatown with the author Charles Yu. This event was brought to you by the Library Foundation and the Office of Mayor Steve Adler.
Welcome, everybody, to the Mayor's Book Club. It's the annual citywide reading campaign. It's brought to you in conjunction with the Library Foundation. This year's selection is Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. It's an important and inventive novel about the Asian American experience. I invite everybody to join us in reading and discussing this book. Head to your nearest library branch and check it out. I'm excited to hear Austinites' take on this year's Mayor's Book Club selection. This National Book Award-winning novel pokes fun at Hollywood stereotypes while exploring timeless themes of race and immigration, assimilation, and family history. This book invites us to empathetically consider the broad range of Asian American experiences that are all too often ignored or cast aside. I encourage all Austin readers to join us in reading this wonderful novel, and I look forward to the important conversations it's going to inspire.
Good evening. My name is Roosevelt Weeks, and I'm the proud director here at the Austin Public Library. And this evening, we want to welcome you to our Mayor's Book Club program. And it's a great collaboration between the foundation, the mayor, and the great staff here at the Austin Public Library. And with that, I want to introduce you to our reference librarian who will introduce our book and our author. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey there, I'm Betsy Blanche, one of the reference librarians here at the Central Library and a very proud Mayor's Book Club committee member. Tonight's book is Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown, and we hope you enjoy the program.
We are joined tonight by Charles Yu. Charles Yu is the author of 4 books, including his latest, Interior Chinatown, which is a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction and the Le Prix Medi Étranger, and longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. He has received the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Award, been nominated for 2 Writers Guild of America Awards for his work on the HBO series Westworld, and has also written for shows on FX, AMC, Facebook Watch, and Adult Swim. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in a number of publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Wired, Time, and Plowshares. Together with TaiwaneseAmerican.org, he has also sponsored the Betty L. and Jin C. Yu Creative Writing Prizes for students. Charles, we're so glad to have you here tonight. Thank you so much. Charles will be taking questions from the audience later in the program, so please send your questions in the chat so that we can ask them at the end of the program. If you look below, you'll see a button that says Q&A, and that is where you'll type in your questions. We will collect them to send them to Charles. We're also pleased to be joined by Hanna Huang, who is moderating our event. Hanna is a Taiwanese Texan who grew up along the Texas border, far away from the comforts of bubble tea shops. Her background in Asian American and Pacific Islander AAPI educational programming and community organizing eventually led to advocacy for Asian American creatives in the arts. Her love of nonprofits, film, and AAPI stories found a unique home as the current executive director of the Austin Asian American Film Festival in Texas. As a longtime volunteer staff member, she finds herself very fortunate to be able to tell her parents that her Asian American Studies degree from UT Austin is one that she makes the use of every day. Some of her fondest memories of reading include spending hours at S-Light bookshops during long summers in Taiwan and hiding in the bathtub to read books late past her bedtime in her childhood. Currently, she is working on an impact campaign for Stories Within, a mini documentary series filmed in the aftermath of the Georgia Asian spa shootings. To learn more and help the project get to $100,000 as a Gold Futures Challenge finalist, you can vote for it at the link that I'm about to drop in the chat. Without further ado, I would like to invite Charles Yu up to our virtual stage to read.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, and thanks everyone. I'm really honored to be here. I would say I'm excited to be here, except for I'm in my house. I'd be much more excited to be in Austin. I've been to Austin a few times for book events and always loved it. And so I'm bummed I don't get to be there. But in any case, I'm excited for the conversation tonight and honored to have been the choice for the Mayor's Book Club. So thank you to everyone who made this possible. I really appreciate it. I will read a bit from Interior Chinatown. I'll just start at the beginning in case you haven't read the book yet. Interior Golden Palace. Ever since you were a boy, you've dreamt of being Kung Fu Guy. You are not Kung Fu Guy. You are currently background Oriental male, but you've been practicing. Maybe tomorrow will be the day. Interior Golden Palace. Ever since you were a boy, you've dreamt of being Kung Fu Guy. You are not Kung Fu Guy. You are currently Oriental Guy making a weird face, but you've been practicing. Maybe tomorrow will be the day. Take what you can get. Try to build a life at the margin, made from bit parts. Willis Wu, Asian actor. Skills, Kung Fu, moderate proficiency. Fluent in accented English. Able to do face of great shame on command. Resume, disgraced son, delivery guy, silent henchman, guy who runs in and gets kicked in the face, striving immigrant, generic Asian man. Your mother has played, in no particular order, pretty Oriental flower, Asiatic seductress, young dragon lady, slightly less young dragon lady, restaurant hostess, beautiful maiden number 1, dead beautiful maiden number 1, old Asian woman. Your father has been, at various times, twin dragon, wizened Chinaman, guy in a soiled t-shirt, inscrutable grocery owner in a soiled t-shirt, egg roll cook, young Asian man, Sifu, the mysterious Kung Fu master, old Asian man. Interior, Golden Palace, morning. In the world of black and white, everyone starts out as generic Asian man. Everyone who looks like you, anyway. Unless you're a woman, in which case you start out as pretty Asian woman. You all work at Golden Palace, formerly Jade Palace, formerly Palace of Good Fortune. There's an aquarium in the front, in cloudy tanks of rock crabs and 2-pound lobsters crawling over each other in the back. Laminated menus offer the lunch special, which comes with a bowl of fluffy white rice and choice of soup, egg drop or hot and sour. A neon Qingdao sign blinks and buzzes behind the bar in the dimly lit space, a dropped ceiling room with lacquered ornate woodwork, or some imitation thereof. Everything simmering in a warm, seedy red glow, thrown off by the dollar store paper lanterns festooned above, many of them darkened by dead moths, the paper yellowing, ripped, curling in on itself. The bar is fully stocked with top shelf spirits up top, middle shelf liquor at eye level, and down at the bottom, a happy hour shelf that you will regret for sure. The new thing everyone is excited about is called the lychee margarita teeny, which seems like a lot of flavors. Not that you've had one. They're $14. Sometimes patrons leave a sip at the bottom of the glass. And if you're quick, while you go through the swinging door that separates the front of the house from the back, you can have a taste. You've seen some of the other generic Asian men do it. It's a risk, though. The director's always got an eye out, ready to fire someone for the smallest infraction. You wear the uniform, white shirt, black pants, black slipper-like shoes that have no traction whatsoever. Your haircut is not good, to say the least. Black and white always look good. A lot of it has to do with the light. They're the heroes. They get hero lighting, designed to hit their faces just right. Designed to hit White's face just right, anyway. Someday, you want the light to hit your face like that. To look like the hero. Or for a moment, to actually be the hero. I'll stop there. Thanks. And by the way, I realized I called Catherine Kathleen. Sorry about that. Apologies.
I'd like to invite Hannah up to moderate this event and ask a few questions of Charles. Afterwards, we'll open up our questions in the audience chat. Hannah, take it away.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited to have this opportunity to interview you and talk with you, Charles. As a fellow Taiwanese American, what was especially striking for me were the areas of the book that you injected a lot of Taiwanese American history and culture. And I actually had an opportunity to also listen to the audiobook as well. And the narrator actually, would pronounce quite well, I thought, Taiwanese phrases. And so I wanted to go ahead and teach the audience a Taiwanese phrase to start out with, which is li ho. So it's similar to ni hao in Mandarin. So it's hi. So in Taiwanese, we would say li ho instead.
Yeah, li ho, li ho. Nice to see you.
Li ho. So kind of delving into our kind of common heritage and Taiwanese American roots. How did you decide which portions to inject that, especially since when we think of Chinatowns and the SRO Chinatown setting, what we're thinking about mostly is maybe a Cantonese community, or more recent communities would be Southern Chinese immigrants?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked about it. It wasn't an intentional choice, until I didn't fully realize how much I had amalgamated things until my wife read it when it was basically done, and she was like, "Well, there's something interesting here, because in some ways you've taken, my wife's family is Cantonese and she's from the Bay Area, and she's like, you've taken parts of that experience and melded it with a very Taiwanese immigrant experience, which is mostly, post 1965. It's a very different, as you're pointing out, a different experience." And I was like, oh, I did do that, didn't I? Uh-oh. But I think what it speaks to, I hope, is that there is this kind of duality for Willis, is that he's living how he is who he is, and yet he's perceived as generic Asian man in his reality. And so those differences are actually kind of lost on, the world in which he inhabits, this procedural cop show. They don't really care about those distinctions. To them, to that show, Willis appears to be functionally virtually the same as anyone else. And so the difference between, say, a Taiwanese immigrant who came in 65 and someone from Toisan who might have come 4 or 5 generations ago is effectively lost in the story. So I think that kind of tension between what's going on inside and then the perception from the outside is a lot of what I was interested in exploring.
Yeah, and kind of going back to that construct of Chinatown, well, we know that Chinatown was really just a a survival tactic. So, and in particular, after the earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco, a group of Chinese members of the community said, we have to create a new space for ourselves that isn't as easily destroyed or left behind during major disasters. What kind of history did you do into like Chinatowns as you were writing this book? And did you have any specifically like influenced Chinatowns?
Yeah, I did do some research, and two books specifically, both of which I steal bits from for the epigraphs. One was American Chinatown by Bonnie Tsui, and the other was San Francisco Chinatown by Philip Choi. I was fascinated by what I learned. I didn't realize, specifically Bonnie's book talks about 5 different Chinatowns in the US. Honolulu, LA, San Francisco, Vegas, and New York. New York, the sort of lower Manhattan one, not Flushing. And so it's what I really found, or what I wanted to read into it and maybe took for the book, was how much Chinatowns had played this dual role in screen, for filming. Mm-hmm. that essentially there, like especially in LA, there were people who lived their normal lives as shopkeepers, and then a Hollywood studio would come along and say, we want to film here, can you pretend that this is Asia, or can you basically be yourself, and we'll turn the cameras on and just not be yourself, but like look how you want to look, or look how we want you to look, because that's essentially the backdrop for the story, that they're shooting basically LA for Asia and using the Asians as the background. And something about that kind of duality got me really interested. It just made me think about I think it goes back to what I was just talking about, this kind of tension between the reality of the lives that these people in Chinatown are living, trying to assimilate here, and then the fact that they're basically still being used, being filmed as foreigners. The setting and their faces are basically being used to signify or to tell a story about, an exotic location.
And, in particular, what was striking was the device you used of the show within the book. And I've read and heard you say on interviews that you're, and it's very evident to me as I was reading, that it's recalls like these Law and Order type of procedural show. So when did you figure out that was kind of something you wanted to parody or use as a device in the book?
Pretty early on. That was one of 3 or 4 key pieces that I had to figure out. So, not to maybe get ahead of the conversation, but in rough order, it was like I heard Willis's kind of interior monologue, and that got me really excited, because I thought, oh, here's a character who has this kind of low-level existence in the show. Or no, I'm sorry, I didn't have a show yet. It's like, who is this person that is generic Asian man and wants to be Kung Fu guy? What does that mean? And then I guess it kind of implied in that is this idea of, oh, he's a background player, but he wants to have this kind of guest star role because that's the best he can do. And so, I guess basically from the first thing, from Willis's consciousness, kind of flowed the second thing, which was, oh, it's a police procedural show, and then from there were a bunch of choices about, like, do I write it as a script, like how do I create the kind of reality of this world? So but I just felt like Law and Order, I have watched a lot of Law and Order. especially watched a lot when my kids were really young, and like I was trapped under a baby, and like I couldn't change the channel. I didn't really want to change the channel. It's great because like one would end and it would roll right into the next one. And I think something about both the sleep deprivation and the I don't know, the kind of iconic structure of a Law and Order just imprinted itself in my brain. I thought this would be perfect because it's such, in a lot of ways, it's like one of our most dominant storytelling forms, right? Like this is, if like future cultural anthropologists study this period of history, they'll be like, oh, they were really into these shows where, they last about 42 minutes and cops figure things out. So
yeah, when I was thinking about that, one of the Law and Order episodes that I remember in particular that was set in New York Chinatown was centered around a villain who was going around, and he was half Black and half Chinese, and was raised by his Chinese grandmother. And I remember how they use that setting of Chinatown in the background. And so as I was reading your book, I definitely thought back and I was thinking back about that episode in particular. And kind of going into a little of your background in screenwriting, actually, because that's where I think there's a lot of the parallels between you wrote the book as a script, or kind of like a script format, and was able to use your background as a screenwriter. Can you speak a little bit more to how, when did you make that decision? And was it just part of the book, or did it expand? And what has your screenwriting career, or how did your screenwriting career help you in terms of writing this book?
Yeah. So after, the Order going Willis, then Law and Order episode, and then I kind of got stuck for a little while. I got stuck on two things. One was, is this a first person or a third person? How do I write this? Or maybe both, maybe I switch back and forth or something. And neither of them felt right. I ended up writing it in second person for some reasons that we could go into. But the other thing that I got stuck on was the idea of, doing it as a script. Do I do that? Because on the one hand, it seemed crazy. Like, how could I really, like, who would want to read that? There was honestly a question of font. I was like, well, if it's a script, it really should be in Courier font. And Courier, no offense to Courier, I love Courier. It got me through a lot of college papers, to expand the length of, but it's ugly. It's not the best looking font. It's classic font, but it's not the prettiest. So I was like, are people going to want to read a book written as a script in this kind of yucky font? And it just ended up being the right form, and I think what it did was really gave a simple, and I don't want to say elegant because calling my own thing elegant, but it was just a very direct, simple way of saying to the reader, here is when you are in black and white, here's when you're in the cop show, and on this level is when you're not. And of course, then I proceed to ignore or break all my own rules. But like, at least at the beginning of the story, I needed a visual and conceptual kind of structure for readers to say, oh, there's an official narrative here. Willis plays a role in that narrative. And then kind of behind the mask or backstage is when he has kind of his interior life. And so the screenplay really allowed me to kind of jump back and forth with Willis's, where is he? Where are we as in the story? So, and, it did help to have, I don't know that I would have had the confidence to try something like that had I not worked in television. At that point, only for a couple of years, but, I was a little more comfortable with some of the conventions and the tropes. And so, yeah, it was a lot of fun because all day long I'd spend in a writer's room trying to help break a story for a show that I didn't create, collaborating. And that's really a lot of fun. It's a lot less pressure too, because, at the end of the day, there's a whole bunch of people whose minds, you're collaborating with. Here, it's like only my thing. But it was fun then to take the same tools that I was using in my day job repurposed them for this novel.
Mhm. You know, I thought you did very fantastically, especially going back to the black and white scenes on the interactions, particularly between Turner and Willis. And there's some very specific interactions that are very relevant now. One very striking scene in particular to me is when Turner tells Willis, like, oh, you like when whites got your back. Like how, especially with kind of the last 2 to 3 years of like racial turmoil we've had in the US in particular, and racial reckoning we've had. Like, did you know, or did you have a sense of what was already happening? Or did you feel like, especially during the last couple of years, you felt your book was, I feel like it's very relevant still, and it kind of calls to some of those conversations I hear my peers in the Asian American community having with peers in the Black community, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I won't pretend that I could have foreseen anything that's happened in the last couple of years. I think to the extent it resonates with recent events, it's because some of these things have been going on for a long time, and specifically, I think the idea of this kind of anxiety for someone like Willis about where does he stand in the sort of like, what is Willis? I mean, I'm not necessarily characterizing it this way, but as a character, I think what Willis is asking himself is, how aggrieved should I feel? Like, how should am I allowed to complain about my situation? Am I allowed to voice things that I feel, inequity? And I think there's a real anxiety for Willis about that. And specifically about, I mean, he voices it, or I think Turner articulates it probably better, is, that Willis, is kind of comparing himself to, and his struggles to the struggles of Black Americans, and that's his model, that's his mental framework for understanding. And he's like that, I think the one thing the book explores is whether or not that makes any sense. Does it make sense to use one framework and try to apply it, even if that means, modifying it at the margins, or I think partly I was trying to focus away from all of that. I was trying to keep the focus on Willis and his story, but it would have been impossible to write the book in a vacuum. I think I tried to imagine a version in which there isn't at least some acknowledgement. Like a version of the book in which Willis and Turner never have that conversation would have been too strange for me, right? Like I can't pretend that Willis isn't having this. But on the other hand, it became very tempting because it was like, this could easily be a book about that. Like that's a whole different book that I wasn't maybe ready to write, or I'm not sure I'm the person to write it, but I did feel like, okay, how do I brush up against this as an idea, and then kind of go, okay, now that we've done that, let's go back to Willis's story. Because I think there's so much to think and talk about in terms of where Willis places himself and where the other Asians place themselves, I guess, in the context of Black and white versus just the story that they're on in this book, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, Willis as a character experiences a lot of like major growth, particularly when he meets his wife, Karen. And she's kind of like a foil to his character in terms of like, she's a much more confident and assured character. She's multiracial, but she speaks better Taiwanese than Willis. Ends up kind of getting along with his mother as well, who he didn't initially want that meeting to happen. So I'm kind of curious, if you had to write a story from Karen's viewpoint or perspective, how would your approach be, or how do you think it would be different?
Ooh, that's a great question. And also, just first of all, I am happy that we're talking about Karen, because I feel like that name has been unfairly maligned. So I'm not taking it on myself alone, but I'm happy to join any campaign to rehabilitate the name Karen.
Mhm.
Such a nice name. I think, yeah, I feel like Karen's story is a story. Well, specifically Karen's story. She's multiracial, and as you mentioned, and um, possibly could pass right in certain environments, or have a certain kind of ambiguity that may read in certain situations potentially to her advantage, I guess, in terms of assimilation or in terms of acceptance. And there's I guess, a tension between Willis's experience and Karen's experience. Karen is also, I think, grown up in a way that Willis really isn't, is much more comfortable kind of, in the role that she's in, and she's much more confident. And so to me, this was like, she's like kind of the aspirational character for Willis. So I have a hard time writing from that point of view. Like, I wrote a short story years ago called Third Class Superhero, which is about a third class superhero. Like, I tend to find the person at the margins and want to write from that perspective. So for me, Karen is a leading person. She's a leading role. I guess if I were writing a story about her perspective, it would be about the ways in which, as I mentioned, that sort of ambiguity, or even the objectification of someone like Karen, seen as maybe attractive or seen as competent, but kind of exoticized. Like, how would you tell that story? I thought about, and my agent, she really pushed me to expand Karen's story in this book. I think I she, at least with respect to her interaction with Willis, but as I was talking about with Turner, I think it's even more true of Karen. The book could have easily pulled completely in that direction, because that's also, to me, she's also very interesting. And so I was wary of oh, I don't want it to become the Karen story either. I'm already having enough trouble finishing this book.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was very interesting how she did help him kind of move on to some degree, and he experienced some success in the kind of the early time with him. But then he still eventually stuck at the 8th floor of Golden Palace, right? In Interior Chinatown, even not just a few floors above his parents. So I thought that plot device of how he moved up, but only within a very specific place, and still with that goal of Kung Fu guy, was particularly interesting. And even when he left Interior Chinatown, there was a lot of judgment about kind of the life that Karen and his child Phoebe was living. It was very foreign to him. And I remember this very strikingly, kind of the scenes of Phoebe in her own show. Were you inspired by shows like Ni Hao Kai Lan, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like the Chinese American version of Dora the Explorer?
Yeah, I was totally inspired by Ni Hao Kai Lan.
Yeah.
I started this book. When I started the book, my kids were pretty young, and so I was watching a lot of kids shows, and they're great. They're also weird, and in such a freeing way. And so I loved the freedom and imagination, and also just at times the just the surrealism almost of some of the environments you're in, and I thought that spoke to kind of Phoebe's freedom versus Willis's, that she is unconstrained. She has kind of broken from her past in a way. Not that she's done that necessarily by herself, but by virtue of the kind of progression, I guess, of assimilation. I think she now finds herself in this weird suburban house that also has castles and and no rules, basically. And so I was definitely trying to capture some sense of this is a very different place that Willis is not comfortable in.
Mhm.
And also that, as you mentioned, I think that there is some judgment or some introspection about, what does this mean? Like, here Willis is thinking that he's locked into this hierarchy of roles, that Kung Fu guy is the highest, and that there's a really clear kind of ceiling, right? The sort of bamboo ceiling for someone like Willis. And then Phoebe has a completely different set of rules for her world.
Yeah. Well, we have a really amazing audience question that has to do with Kung Fu Guy that I wanted to go ahead and ask. So Rock asked, he's curious about your thoughts on the Marvel film Shang-Chi. Some might say a more self-aware Kung Fu Guy story. Is this progress or progress with an asterisk?
Thanks for the question. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll disclaim from the beginning that I will not give you a clear answer. I promise that. I will turn on my lawyer brain and try to talk out of both sides of my mouth. One, I really like the movie. I watched it with my kids, and it was the first movie we had seen, since the pandemic started. So that was just really exciting. And then of all things, to be this kind of big Marvel superhero movie, starring, and basically all Asian main cast. It was just, I lied. I think it is progress. I mean, I think that's clearly progress, right? I think that the progress can have, there's complexity to it. There's still a lot of Kung Fu. It's still a Kung Fu story, right? So, and a lot of reviews I read noted that the action in this movie is much better than in most Marvel movies, if not all Marvel movies. Because when you kind of look at what they are, there's a lot of visual effects and there's a lot of quippy banter and like cool comic lore. But this had like genuine action in it, and that was really exciting and beautiful to watch. And so, and yet at the same time, I think the question has this embedded to it. It's two parts. Like, one, isn't this just a reinforcement of the category that we've seen before, right? Which is, yes, you can have a big blockbuster, but it's got to have martial arts in it. And basically it's got to have Kung Fu guy in it. And that the Asian Marvel superhero is Kung Fu guy, essentially. I think that will quickly go away, because I think the next movie coming out in like November has other Asians that are probably not going to be doing martial arts. So, this is the Chloe Zhao movie, which looks like it's got, like Kumail Nanjiani and Gemma Chan, and just so that's so exciting. But the other thing I think is, even the success of something like this movie, could it lead to the unintended consequence of the wrong, I don't want to say lessons, but the wrong takeaway, I guess, right? Which is, oh yeah, let's do more of this. And so then does it become this like, yes, lots of progress, more opportunity for Asian Americans in media, but maybe not as much in terms of variety or depth of role. But I don't know. If you had asked me 10 years ago, like, does it seem possible? I would say definitely not. So in that way, I have to feel like it's progress.
Yeah, and then one of the key things that a lot of people point out about Shang-Chi is it was kind of like you had to take back a very racist story and part of Marvel comic history in order to rehabilitate, the character and the story for these times, essentially too.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I feel like, I mean, I don't know if this is too Pollyanna-ish, but there felt like a sincere, what you're saying, Hannah, it's like, it felt like a sincere attempt to basically reboot, in a lot of ways, the character and the backstory for this time.
And a little bit similar to kind of what we're talking about is this uprise or this kind of cultural movement for Asian Americans, right? That's, we've had a lot of great Asian American movies and Asian movies that have been making a lot of waves, from Parasite, Minari, and several others, not to mention all the Asian American filmmakers that are up and coming. But even despite all of this, we see, Stop Asian Hate having to be such a huge campaign because we do have that uptick in hate crimes against Asians. That it's unfortunately very related to the current pandemic. What I'm seeing culturally also is that I see in the community there's a pushback against Stop Asian Hate, or even talking about Asian American racism and discrimination, in order to replace it or to only celebrate Asian joy. And I know some of your interviews for this book in particular, you kind of talked about not just celebrating only the successes and the wins, but all of the kind of like broken moments and the non-wins of Asians in the American experience in particular. Did you know when you began writing, like this is kind of the direction you wanted to go? You write specifically a lot for kind of these marginal and underdog characters, and was that very intentional to continue doing that, especially in this book?
Yes, is the short answer. I think I probably won't do any better than your question, but I'll just try. I should probably just stop talking and say yes. But yes, the impulse, and I think it's easy for me to forget, honestly, in talking about it. The impulse, though, that the book started from was these, I think, as you said, broken moments. I think it's beautiful. It's like there's the whole there was this kind of feeling of like, I have this loose box full of moments, of anecdotes or bits of like life, and that don't cohere into a story, that really resist kind of an arc, and what do I do with them? How do I make a story out of like what are really kind of these kind of quiet moments of, striving or frustration or tenderness or misunderstanding, of and so I think, yeah, I really think that it's ultimately the container that they found themselves in is like the opposite of that. It's this preset kind of narrative arc that forces everything to a kind of resolution. And I think the tension between those two things was one of the things I was interested in.
Yeah. And I know, like, a specific, very tragic scene and story during when you're exploring kind of the backstory of the parents was that of Alan Chen, the other Taiwanese American that the father knew, and his daughter Christine, who I thought this story was like an amazing example of that generational trauma that's really passed down. And Alan Chen in particular, very successful guy, but he went through a very violent hate crime where he was attacked for his race, and then subsequently he had a lot of professional and personal success, but has migraines that for the rest of his life that plague him, and he also ends up taking his life. And then we kind of see Christine, his daughter, also experience a very violent hate crime, a similar head injury that leaves her with migraines. And then her trajectory is that she just doesn't go back to Chinatown anymore. How did this story, like, I'm kind of curious where this story came from. Was there any specific inspirations, or how did you know that this was an important part of the story you were trying to tell?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the course of doing research, the kind of one thing I was really surprised about was the number of sort of anti-Asian riots there were, especially on the West Coast, where there was a lot of, it was as a result of, tension between the white laborers who felt like they were being displaced by Asian labor, or Chinese labor specifically in that case. And and yet I think one of the things that surfaced for me was that was something I didn't learn about, in history. Like it's not, wasn't in high school. The first place I would have learned about it was as an undergrad, taking an Asian American Studies class. And that's also where, I first learned about the Vincent Chin case, and I think that had this really kind of a deep impression on me. One, because of sort of what happened and the aftermath of what just sort of didn't happen to the attackers, but to the killers. But then the other part is the idea that he was mistaken, that Vincent Chin's attackers didn't even understand the difference, between Chinese and Japanese. And that, that was a kind of psychological sort of seed to this idea of of the external kind of perception of all these Asians are basically fungible, are the same. And so that was kind of where those two things, I guess, sort of the sheer amount of violence there had been that really kind of isn't really part of the history book that I had when I was a kid. And then specifically, I think the Vincent Chin case, which obviously is a real case. I was really trying not to co-opt, someone's actual life and story and family. But, I'd be lying if I didn't say it had a deep impression on me.
I thought the way you kind of continued that story to the next generation of Christine was very powerful in illustrating how it goes down to the next generation, right? It's and it continues, and it turns people off from trying to, or what it recalled for me was kind of even the experience of Japanese Americans going through internment camps, and then especially the young ones coming out afterwards, and they don't do anything that's Asian or Japanese or adjacent at all anymore, culturally. And so that's what it reminded me specifically of.
Yeah, that's such I think what you're talking about to me is, one of the things that I think in Willis's psychology is what you just put your finger on, is this kind of learned invisibility, or learned, inferiority. It's not inferiority exactly in this case, but it's an attempt to basically blend into the background so well, and that involves basically learning the rules of the system and then trying not to stick out. And that's a form of survival or even success.
And kind of going to back over to the parents, I particularly wanted to touch upon Dorothy and her story, and particularly when they first meet in Interior Chinatown. So when they first meet, Ming Chen Wu introduces himself and asks, like, what's your name? And she doesn't have a name. She says she doesn't have a name. And he says, choose one. So the one she chooses is Dorothy, which is, from what I can, it's implied that it's from the movie, probably The Wizard of Oz, where there's a Dorothy in there because she has fond memories of watching movies in her childhood in Taiwan. I'm kind of curious though, if why did you have her choose an American name in particular? And then why was it that she never revealed her name in Mandarin? And then on the opposite side, you have Ming Chen Wu, who doesn't have an Americanized name. He goes by his Romanized name.
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever been asked this, and so thank you for asking it. And now I get to reveal all my secret. No, I yes, the kind of Wizard of Oz feeling of was what I was going for with Dorothy's name. And honestly, I mean, it comes down to, I thought it was interesting to have a contrast between the couple. I think growing up, I had friends that had, basically their kind of Romanized Chinese name, right? And, or Taiwanese name, as it were. But I think specifically, it's usually their, as you said, their Mandarin name Romanized. And that's how they went through life, in school. And people were often either sort of struggling with it, or, I always wondered, and I have, a Chinese and a Taiwanese name. And but I was never anything but Charles on my birth certificate, on my, and I just thought it there might be kind of something interesting about having two characters who had these two sort of different markers and what it might say about them. I don't know that it necessarily maps onto like specifically their characters, but just this kind of duality, of like, you have a name, and and I think it's changed so much now, even from like when I was a kid versus when people like Dorothy and Ming Chen would have come. But I don't know, there's something in that I found interesting that goes to the question of blending in versus not blending in, or how do you go about making a new home and a new language, yeah.
Particularly striking was I moderated a book club discussion a couple of days ago, and I shared that with my parents. It's the same way too. It's my mother has a chosen name she goes by, a more Americanized name. And then my father, well, frankly, he could not decide on an American name. He tried a couple of times, and he was like, I'm just going to go by my Romanized name. And I noticed that for your parents, it's similar too. And I wonder if that's like a parallel, or that's just something that happens in our community where, especially women, you just know them by kind of the Americanized, like the first name. And even if legally their last name hasn't changed, they're just known as Mrs., whatever the surname is. Is that something else you've noticed as well, or first time you've heard this?
This is the first time. Again, you are breaking new ground for me, because it may have occurred to me at one point during the writing of it that my own parents mirror Dorothy and Ming Chen, but I definitely had not thought of what you're saying, that maybe it's more common that women tend to adopt, maybe a Western name versus that I had not thought of. Now I have to think about that for a while. That's very interesting.
There was another book club member who also shared that was the same way for their parents too, and she was Chinese American. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And also, I think it does say a lot about just female Asian characters in Hollywood and in the history of media. It's, you just kind of have like the Dragon Lady, the more exotified Asian woman in the background who maybe just has a name, like a first name only. So that's what I particularly thought of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were there any other particular points when you're writing the parent stories that you enjoyed? Or I know that you particularly even put in a scene about Taiwanese martial law times, and especially in Ming Chen Wu's story. Did you have to do some research into that, or was that a conversation you might have had with your parents about what it was like even?
Definitely conversations through growing up and just hearing about it all the time, and going to, as we were talking about briefly before we started the event, going to youth conferences and things that my parents were involved with. So yeah, and then doing a bit of research. Shauna Yang Ryan's book Green Island was
fantastic. I love her book.
I have to cite it, and it's I think, but it isn't something that I feel like has been widely written about, other than it just hasn't in a lot of, at least American novels I've seen. So I felt like it was an important part of the backstory of these characters.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And then Dorothy's story in particular, like it ends with her taking care of her sister, who had actually cast her out. What were you trying to kind of say about her character in particular with that story, or that part of the story ending the way it did, where she kind of takes over and cares for her elder sister who she did not have a good relationship with? And yeah.
Yeah, I think, on one level, the real answer is that felt like the true story, that felt like what happened. On the other level, I think there was some impulse of like, wanting for there to be, more complication to this family narrative, that it isn't as simple as like a family comes and helps helps themselves, and that there could be a kind of competition, or a sense of like uh but that they're human, that they're flawed, and that there could be um family trying to hurt other family members in this story. So
Mhm. And I kind of want to go back a little bit to how this book is an amalgamation of all your works and influences in life, in terms of your screenwriting, your TV writing, an exploration of Asian American identity, and then it has law moments because you
yeah.
also were a lawyer, and then there's an older younger brother dynamic, which you also have in your family. Did you realize how much of your own life was that you were going to pull at, or was it similar, like what you said earlier, was you didn't notice it until the Taiwanese American parts, until you had somebody else read into it?
Yeah. um yeah, definitely not. It's almost like it sort of appalling when I have
Mhm.
that realization, because I'm a little afraid, like, uh-oh, I hope that, people in my life don't think that this was on purpose, or that I'm saying anything about them. It's sadly, I can only control my own like what comes out so
Mhm.
much, and um I really had a lot of trouble finishing this book, or starting it, writing the middle, and finishing it. Like, it was trouble from start to finish. It was really difficult. And once the story started to take shape, it was hard to divert it, because it felt like, as you said, kind of a culmination of a lot of things that I had been trying to piece together. And it would have done some kind of, harm to the book, I think, to then change it, for even after I realized, oh, this is a little too close for comfort. So
Mhm.
um yeah, I I always think I'm not going to make the same mistake again, but I think the subconscious has a way of bubbling up in ways that I can't predict or control, to be honest.
Mhm. Well, my next question kind of has to do with the surprise reappearance, or appearance, so to speak, of a character that's talked about throughout the book, but doesn't really come out until the end, which is Big Brother. And, he kind of, it was kind of funny how he was like, they were like, "Oh, where were you?" And he was like, "I was at law school." Now I'm
Right.
back. And I found that just very humorous, to have that. It's kind of like a convention you see, like in a show, where they just explain things away with something that doesn't quite make sense, but it just works and you just move on. So how did you decide to kind of re-inject Big Brother in that way? And what was it about his character that was able to break away from the world of Interior Chinatown so much earlier, that made it so hard for Willis to?
Hmm. Right. Yeah. I Yeah, there were versions of the book where older brother kind of figures into the story in a more substantial way, or that was the intention, and I couldn't quite finish though. Like, it just never developed that way. So he sort of went away for a while, and then I was like, oh, where is this guy? Like, what happened to him? And then there was a little bit of, I don't have him that often, but one of those aha moments was like, oh, this would be a good time for him to come back. He's actually been at law school, and he can come back in the scene. And it also gives me the Law and Order structure of, like, first half is police, second half is courtroom. And so then I sort of was like, well, what's he been doing? Like, why did, and again, it may be one of those things where uh, you could either think of it as like backfilling
Mhm.
something that I'm trying to get to, or just an expression of like some underlying impulse, or subconscious connection. But I think actually the way I think of it now is, that he was the guy who had all the paths available to him, right? As Willis talks about early on in the book, he could climb the ladder pretty easily. And so as a result, he got to those places much faster than Willis did. He got to places Willis really didn't get to, and still realized basically, I'm on a treadmill, or I'm stuck here, or there's no real way out. And so he ended up taking a very different path, basically leaving the show or going on a different show called Law School, and that we don't see, and I also thought that was a different kind of way of exploring both the model minority myth and sort of like the idea of paths to assimilation through socioeconomic sort of, success. So, I didn't end up telling that much of his story, but that's kind of what was going on in the back of my head.
Interesting. And how you ended at the book and kind of had Willis break the cycle of being the throwaway Asian character on a TV show was quite interesting. How long did it take you to get to that, like, this is what's going to happen, or that he's not going to be, he makes it like a very distinct choice to not be the dead Asian guy basically at the end, right? How did you decide on that ending in particular?
Well, it took like, 6.5 years or something. The thing they say, which I think is true, I don't know who they is, but you're looking for the ending. I was looking for the ending that's both sort of feels inevitable yet sort of surprising, that, and I think in this case maybe more inevitable than surprising to me. It's more like if we're following the arc, I guess, of Willis's thing, it's that he breaks out of his arc altogether. And so what does that really mean? Well, it means that he's kind of not playing by the rules anymore. He's broken out of his own interior sort of, mental Chinatown. And so it felt like, to me, that felt like, I don't want to say logical progression, but it felt like the emotional progression of where he should end up.
Well, I'm very curious to also hear, because I heard that Hulu has picked up Interior Chinatown for a series. So first of all, congratulations on that. And you probably can't say or share too much, but if you had a dream cast, who are some select characters that you would cast with Asian Americans that you know or you don't know?
Thanks. Yeah. I've really enjoyed working with Hulu, and also there's producers on the project who have been great. And, fingers crossed, we'll see, like, between now and actually airing episodes, there are still a couple hurdles, but we're getting closer, which is really exciting. I don't know. I mean, I have to say, like, I really love Simu Liu, Shang-Chi. I think in a lot of ways his life is Kung Fu guy. It's like he was, I mean, it's incredible. It's like crazy. And yet on the other hand, it's like, well, he's also older brother, because, like, look at him. He's literally a superhero now. So, like, how could he play an underdog? But I on the other hand, I just feel like there's, I don't know. If I get, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I feel like it'd be really neat to find Asian actors or Asian American actors out there or Asian Canadian actors, who are literally undiscovered, and so there would be something really gratifying and special about that too.
Well, you could go through all the Law and Order, like the extra castings people, and see if they have a list of people that you can pull from.
Yeah, great idea.
Yeah. Well, my last question before we kind of go to the rest of the audience questions is, what are some current works or projects that you're working on or you have coming up that the audience can look for, whether writing or like a screen project?
Yeah. So there's that, Interior Chinatown. I have a number of other projects, both for feature film and for TV, that are in various stages of development. So I'm not allowed to talk about them, sadly, but Some of them are based on things I've written, like short stories or books, and
Mhm.
some of them are other ideas. So that's keeping me busy. I really want to start another book, but at the moment I'm working on film and TV. I am kicking around ideas for, short stories and a new book, but I learned from last time not to talk about anything because I
We'll
talked
just have
about
to
it.
keep our ears open.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, definitely. Let's go to some audience questions then from Steve. Steve asks, what could you say about the shifting realities where the characters are in the show, but it's also their realities?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, what I could say is I got really confused for a long time because you know, I had this sense of like there's blurriness between the two worlds, and so I was really afraid that my editor would force me to articulate the rules. And then of course he did, and my agent was like, oh, what is the logic of this? And but it was a good exercise, and not just exercise, it was an important step because I think from that I realized that I was both kind of creating rules and then eventually breaking them. And that's kind of the point. Like, I guess for me the short answer is Willis is slipping between these two realities. And one, he's, which meaning like his mental construct, the Chinatown which he inhabits in his head, and then this show is an external thing that he doesn't really have control over. But there is a kind of blurriness at the edges of both. Like, where does one start and the other begin? Or, you know what I'm saying? And like, so I'm not sure that, we have time to parse out where it goes. I'm not sure I could, honestly, but I think there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of like how much of this is real and how much of this is in his head.
Oh. And we also have from Sydney, did you gather inspiration for the setting from the story from personal experience growing up in a Chinatown? If so, has this been a personal story you wanted to share for a while? If not, did your preconceptions of Chinatowns change after researching for this?
Thanks. Sorry, I forgot the name of the questioner. I did not have a lot of personal experience with a Chinatown. I grew up in Southern California in LA. And so I guess Monterey Park would have been, kind of a Chinatown. Of course, there's actual LA Chinatown. We didn't go there very often, but went a few times as a kid. And then there's like the whole San Gabriel Valley area, which I like to call the Boba Belt of like towns where there's just like, but these kind of ethno-burbs or enclaves. And I did kind of, I guess what I had was my parents were part of a kind of Taiwanese American community in Southern California. And so it was more of a social and kind of cultural community that was pretty tight knit because maybe relative to other parts of the country, there were a lot, but just in an absolute sense, there really weren't a lot of Taiwanese Americans when they first came. So they all tended to keep in touch with each other. So that was my sort of, I guess, psychological, cultural background for it. But I didn't have direct experience with like an actual Chinatown until, like repeated experience until I really did the research, My wife is, as I mentioned, she's Cantonese background. And so grew up like going to Oakland Chinatown every day for like Chinese school or to visit her grandma. And so she had much more experience with it. And I've, stolen bits from her over the years, but yeah.
Yeah. And Monterey Park, there's areas that were called Little Taipei, actually.
Right.
Especially a couple of the little strips around where you do still see a lot of Taiwanese businesses to this day. And then we have from Angie, if you could communicate what white America should take away from your book and how it should impact their actions, what would it be?
Thanks, Angie. I would be hesitant to prescribe that. I feel like, to me, it's a story. It's a story about Willis Wu and his family and the other characters. White and black included, Green and Turner included, and the I don't. I don't know if this is a message or a moral or anything, but the goal is that for me was to humanize this character. Like I heard Willis's voice. I said, this is a consciousness I would like for people to inhabit. I would like to drop the reader into Willis's head, into his life, and hear this voice. And then I hope in the course of the story, all the other characters also, we see dimensions to them. We see humanity to them that isn't immediately apparent when they're first kind of described as these stereotypical roles, that once the masks start to slip off, that all of them sort of reveal, who they are underneath. And so that's my hope for it.
Oh, and then we have a wonderful question next. Given that this novel satirizes television and that you've written for television, what are you watching now? Any recommendations?
Yeah, I am just starting. So if anyone's out there, don't spoil it for me, please. But Only Murders in the Building, which is on Hulu, which is a lot of fun. And Steve Martin and Martin Short and Selena Gomez. And what else am I watching? Oh, Succession. I love Succession. It's, I think it's my favorite show on TV. I love it.
And then do we have any more questions, staff? Or does anyone else in the audience have more questions? Please feel free to put them in. I think we have a follow-up question from Sydney as well. Do you feel your writing, the stylish and actorless script, was a way to build the surreal walls of a fantastical Chinatown and then break them in literary form?
Thanks, Sydney. I like the way you put it. I think that's right. And it reminded me, I think, Hannah, you may have asked something about kind of related to this, and I failed to answer it. But I do think that this was not a real Chinatown. I did research. I try to think about where this is, but when I really think about it, it's kind of, it's not a fully physical place. It's a mental construct that also is a real place where people live and work. That to me, that overlay is what's interesting. So, and yeah, I think the idea was to build this mental place and then have Willis try to escape it, and see some of the, the seams and the places where there's, where there's like secret trap doors and things like that as ways out.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Carmeletta. What advice would you give to aspiring writers?
Thanks, Carmeletta. You would think that I'd have like an easy stock answer. I don't. I don't want to say anything that you've probably already heard 100 times, Carmeletta. I think one, one thing that I found is that when I started to write, I thought that I had to sound a certain way. My prose had to sound the way that it sounds in like books in the store or the library. And I found that finding my own voice was really important. And that didn't always sound great. Like the true sound that my voice makes is not great. It's just my voice. But the more I started to get comfortable with that idea, the more I found like it was coming from an authentic place and that people were starting to get interested in it, versus times when I try to sound like someone else or try to sound like a quote writer, it just never works out. I'm always very boring when I try to do any, writing in a voice that's not mine.
And kind of going along with the book or the TV recommendations, do you have any like books or authors that you are particularly drawn to or want to recommend to the audience?
Yes. You'd think that I would also have this at hand. Gosh, I'm reading a lot of things. I really loved How Much of These Hills is Gold.
I loved it too.
I see Pam.
Yeah.
Jay Caspian Kang just came out with a book called The Loneliest Americans, which is getting a lot of coverage for good reason. It's I think it's such a fascinating book. It's not really a memoir. It's a series. It's a collection of essays exploring Asian American identity, or whether or not that term actually what it means. And so and he goes into a lot of history and a lot of I don't know what you'd call it. I guess examination of things. So yeah, there are a couple.
Yeah. What we have another audience question from Fu. What advice would you give to younger Asian American writers on how to find their voice?
Yeah, how to find your voice. The way I do it is I write about 100 things, and then I throw them all away, and I'm like, why didn't those 100 things work? And then usually when I'm like a little tired, or maybe a little hungover, I mean, to be honest, like it's when my guard is down a little bit, is what I'm saying. Like it could be getting out of the car, getting out of the shower. It's like when my conscious editor brain isn't kind of filtering what's underneath. That's when I find that I'm like actually writing more honestly, or trying to say or express something that is coming from somewhere deeper. So I don't know if that helps, but again, it kind of goes back to, I have to take off the writer hat, where I think, oh, this is me writing. And it's like, what is really the impulse underneath all of it? What is the thing that like is me vibrating from the inside that I want to get out? So.
Yeah, that's great. And I have one last question. I lied last time I said I had a last question, but I know that our mutual friend Ho Chi Tai, who founded TaiwaneseAmerican.org, and you worked together to create a Taiwanese American writing scholarship. What was that experience like of creating that, and then going through the entries with Shauna Yang Ryan and selecting what have been amazing, the honorable mentions to the winners, and from young Asian American writers?
Yeah, thank you for asking it. It's funny, I was going to ask you before we started if you knew Ho Chi, but I was like,
everyone knows
no
Ho Chi.
question. I didn't ask, because literally I was like, she knows Ho Chi. And it was awesome. Like it just came together so beautifully. I've known Ho Chi since I was in like 8th grade. We went to TAF, which is Taiwanese American Foundation, a camp in Michigan, and we were in the same small group. And so I've known him, gosh, I guess that's 30 years. So we've kept in touch a bit over the years, and he's been really good about it. And after, things settled down a little bit after finishing the book tour and everything, and in the middle, or towards the end of last year, I just thought, well, I'm getting to have all these great conversations. There's some energy and momentum, and like, what do I do with that? And I thought of like, I bet I know a person who, like, Ho Chi just sort of connects people and has this incredible sort of mind for like how to do, how to like build communities, basically, I think. And so one thing that was interesting, I think, and he was really instrumental in, was like, oh, let's try to build a community around, a writing award. So yes, it's wonderful to recognize a bunch of high school and college, student writers, but at the same time, it's just as much about all of the entries and all of the like people that might have writing and say, I don't know what to do with this. I literally don't know who I would send this to, and for them to have a place to send it to now, I think they had that before with TaiwaneseAmerican.org, but yeah, we just kind of wanted to give create this, and Shauna Yang Ryan was, generous and amazing, and she's a really brilliant writer, but also a great person. And so she was kind enough to, serve as co-judge and read entries with me this year. And that was just a really great experience, like to see all the young voices and also to work with her. So
that's wonderful. And are y'all planning on continuing it from year to year?
That's the plan. Yeah.
Great. Looking forward to next year's entries.
Yeah.
One last question. I think we're gonna wrap up with this one is again from Rock. With your brother a writer and also an actor, was there anything in your upbringing where you were on a path to pursue or encouraged to pursue the creative arts? Albeit with the lawyer stop.
Right. Thanks, Rock. Not for me. For my brother Kelvin, he's one of those guys who are like, early on, people thought, oh, he's so funny and charismatic, and so he kind of got into acting pretty young, like as a kid, basically, and was on TV in college. You know, he got his first acting job when he was still at UCLA. I was like the opposite. I was pre-med. I did not get into medical school, and which is a good thing. Trust me, for the world, it's good that I am not a doctor, because that would have been terrible. So then I applied to law school, thinking like, oh, you know, I could read or write or teach. And then when I started working as a lawyer is when I started writing. So fiction anyway. I mean, I did take poetry in undergrad, but I kind of didn't do anything with that after college. So it's really weird, but somehow we both ended up in the same field now. I think, you know, I think it comes from a combination of like, my mom is this sort of like very funny, charismatic person and who has a lot of energy. And my dad is like this kind of like philosophical kind of thinker. And so I guess that's where the writing comes from. I'm not really sure how it happened.
Is there opportunity in the future for like a family collab or a sibling collab?
My brother's too busy, you know. I think he's got so much going on, but yeah.
I mean, he was a writer for a very long time on Bob's Burgers, right? And then for those of y'all who don't know, he was actually in Aziz Ansari's Master of None season 1. But yeah, I'm very excited so my first introduction to the Yu brothers was Ho Chi Tai, who I remember emailing and being like, hey, who should I program for my Taiwanese American student conference? I don't know, 11 years ago now, aging myself a little, but yeah, and Ho Chi was like, oh, you should check out this. And I remember he sent me, y'all used to have this like Yu brothers website actually back in the day, which I don't think is around anymore, right? How did y'all create that? Or was that something y'all did for fun?
Yeah, I think it was with an eye towards maybe someday working on something, but it was more for fun. Kelvin had a really good friend named Ted Sanneman, and he's just a talented graphic designer, and Ted created the site. So yeah, I actually forgot about that. That's pretty cool that you remember that.
Yeah, well, I think that's all I had. I guess we'll turn it back to the Library Foundation.
Thanks, Hanna.
Wow, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you, both of you, Hanna and Charles, for being here. I feel like I speak for everyone in the room. It was really wonderful, and you guys were very delightful. If you audience members would like to continue seeing these programs, please visit our website at austinlibrary.org, where you can support programs like these. This event was brought to you by the Library Foundation and Austin Public Library, and generously supported by the Talker Foundation, but you can help today too. Thank you again for being here. Have a great night.